My name is Sarah Bernhardt, and I am the founder and director here at Intersect Arts Center, where our mission is to enrich place and people through the arts. So this gallery is a place where we believe that looking and listening, especially to diverse perspectives that artists bring into this place, is a deeply enriching practice. So tonight we are going to look and listen to a challenging conversation. And to borrow a phrase that's on the back of your program, we invite you into that with, we invite you in to hold space for that and to listen with kind ears and an open heart. Tonight we will be enriched by the beautiful musicianship of Adam Chodorowski, Adam Chodorowski on violin and Kevin Huxhold on piano. They will be gracing us with some musical interludes composed by Arvo Pärt, and they will be placed in between each segment of our conversation tonight. You can read more about the music on the back of your program as well. We will also no doubt encounter enriching conversation from our three panelists. We have professor and author Marie Griffith with us, artist and professor Heather Bennett, and artist of the work on view here tonight, Megan Kenyon. One note per the artist's request, Megan actually asked me to introduce her as the artist of the work on view and her favorite job title, the Master of Mayhem. I will let you, the gracious audience, determine if she is deserving of that title by the end of this conversation. But it is such a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Thank you for holding space. Please join me in welcoming our musicians and our panelists.
I wonder if this will work. I sort of want to leave it on. Well, maybe. Good evening, everyone. I just want to add my welcome to Sarah's and also to thank her and everyone at this beautiful space, Intersect Arts Center, for your generosity in hosting us this evening and enabling the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University to collaborate in putting on this wonderful event. And thanks so much to all of you who are here. Thank you for coming tonight. As you see, we are recording the event, and we'll have the recording probably on Intersect's website, and I know we'll have it on the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics website. So if you want to make sure you have access to the recording, you can email us at RAP at Wustl, WUSTL.edu, or ask one of us afterwards, and we'll be glad to give you access. It usually takes a couple of weeks to get the videotapes online. We are, of course, in this beautiful space to soak up the dazzling work of Megan Kenyon and to discuss it from a range of analytic perspectives, artistic, cultural, religious, and more. And I'm going to be moderating as well as commenting on the work. And before I introduce my co-panelists and outline how the program will go, I want to say just a few personal words about Megan, which I hope can add some additional context to my participation here tonight. I first met Megan in the fall of 2021 when she enrolled in a class that I was teaching entitled American Religion, Gender, and Sexuality. I was surprised to have a fine arts graduate student enroll in what was pitched as an undergraduate class, and so of course she came to me to discuss what additional work she'd need to complete in order to count it for her graduate work. The class took a historical approach to investigating how religious beliefs about gender and sexuality, and more specifically Christian theological ideals about womanhood and manhood, have framed broader cultural gender norms and expectations and ideals both in and beyond the United States, well beyond the doors of the churches. Students were meant to leave the course better understanding Christianity's really heavy social and political role in regulating the behavior of American adults and children, as well as its uses in legal and judicial decisions that affect all of us, Christian and otherwise. But by the second week, it was clear that Megan had a deep understanding of these issues already. She was coming into the course understanding Christianity's intersection with gender ideology at a lived gut level. And what she needed from the course, I think, was some historical education in how all of this came to be, and some scholarly evidence and analysis for all that her life experience and intuition had showed her to be true. That fall 2021 semester was still peak pandemic, of course, and masks were required on campus. So I had to gauge interest levels by students' eyes. You remember when that was all we could see? And boy, were Megan's eyes expressive. I could, as were her hairstyles, which changed frequently. I could almost literally see the connections between what we were reading and what she had lived just pop like electric lines in every class. And by the end of the semester, it was clear that the other students and I had learned as much from Megan as she had from the class. We didn't stay in close touch in the spring semester, but when I walked into my fall 2022 course, there she was again. This time, the course was called The Abuse Crisis in Modern Christianity. And it was intended to explore the clergy sexual abuse crisis across Catholic and Protestant contexts in the United States. How has do we see the abuse crisis as simply a few bad apples, or is it a sign of institutional corruption? How has the church's response been shaped by fear of scandal, hatred of secular culture, and theological teachings on gender and sex? How does sexual abuse fit into the history of the church as a hierarchical, patriarchal institution? And what challenges does the abuse crisis pose to people of faith who are committed to the church and can trust ever be repaired? These were our questions. And by then, I knew that Megan was an ideal student to have in that class. Masks were optional by then, and like most students and faculty, she usually chose not to mask. So I could now see the expressiveness in her whole face, and I knew that she was continuing to make crucial connections between what we were reading and discussing and her own life and the world around her. So eventually she asked me to serve on her MFA thesis committee, which I was honored to do, and through that experience I learned much more deeply about Megan's artistic gifts and her discipline and the wondrous creativity with which she was able to express her knowledge, her ideas, and her burning questions about the church in material form using a wide variety of media. And also through that committee, I met Megan's other advisors and interlocutors, including my co-panelist, Heather Bennett. When Megan told me she was going to have the chance to exhibit her work here at Intersect Arts Center, we started talking about the possibility of having WashU sponsor an event at the gallery. I don't remember if you broached it first or if I did, but so here we are at long last. So that's just a bit of context for how this came to be and how fortunate I am to have gotten to know Megan over the past 2.5 years. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Heather Bennett, whom we're so delighted agreed to speak at this event tonight. Heather earned both a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Printmaking at Washington University in St. Louis, graduating with honors in both degrees, and a Master of Fine Arts in Painting at Hunter College in New York. She spent 14 years living and working in New York City before beginning her current position as a senior lecturer at WashU, where she joined the faculty as the Louis Beaumont Visiting Artist Fellow in 2013. You can see a lot more of her work on her website, heatherbennett.com, which I urge you to look at. As an artist, she maintains a multimedia practice, which consists of photography, video, drawing, text, sculpture, installation, as well as collaborations with musicians and writers, such as we have tonight. Her work traces the female subject and its historic irrelevance, focusing specifically on representation in contemporary culture. She's been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions nationally and internationally, including galleries in Paris, Barcelona, Rome, Austria, and Norway. And a monograph of her work was published in 2010 called Sidetrack: Snapshots, Outtakes, and Polaroids, 2001 to 2008. Her work has been widely reviewed in major publications, and again, on her website, you can learn more about her rich and varied work and her exhibitions, publications, teaching, and numerous awards. I'm tonight's second commentator, Marie Griffith. Now you know me. I'm a scholar of religion and a professor at WashU. I'm the former director of the Center on Religion and Politics and former editor of the Center's journal, Religion and Politics. And as you've guessed from the courses that I teach, my work focuses on American Christianity and the conflicts within that tradition over gender and sexuality issues. And I've published a few books. Maybe the most relevant for tonight is God's Daughters, Evangelical Women and the Power of Submission, and Moral Combat: How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics. And I am now working on the clergy sexual abuse crisis across Catholic and Protestant contexts. Now a more formal introduction for Megan Kenyon, an interdisciplinary artist here in St. Louis. Her primary medium is oil, but as you see all around you, she works in many other media as well, from pen and ink to ceramics. Her work focuses on making space for empathy and understanding between disparate groups and ideas, looking for common language in both words and pictures. She's keenly interested in storytelling related to evangelical experience, and most particularly the experience of women. And through her art, she mines visual images and written texts to investigate the complexities of Christian practice, church history, and spiritual abuse. She is a recent grad of WashU's Master of Fine Arts in Visual Art program and has shown her work at a variety of galleries, including the Kranzberg and the Kemper Museum. And she's also pursuing a graduate degree in theology and the arts at Fuller Theological Seminary. So here's how tonight is going to go. Megan is now going to speak for about 10 minutes about her art. And later in the program, we will have commentary from Heather and from me. And these presentations are going to be interspersed with 3 5-minute windows for all of you here to explore the prompts that Megan has generated for our reflection and our written response in the journals that you see before you on the tables. With music provided, we're very grateful to you all, to carry us along. And then we'll have plenty of time for your own questions to Megan and a group discussion at the end of the program before we disband for a festive reception, which we hope you can stay for, and we'll close. The reception will end and the evening will end as a whole no later than 8:30. And so now please join me in welcoming Megan to speak about her work that surrounds us tonight.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Women's Chapel. And I don't know if you know this, but tonight you guys are actually all part of a participatory art project. And so I'm going to do with you one of the things I love doing with the collaborative group that I worked with, which I'll talk about them a little bit more here in a second, where I'm going to ask a question, and then we won't be able to have a large group discussion because there are many of us here. But I'm hoping you'll respond a little bit and that it'll kind of generate some moments of connectivity that will help lead us into the rest of the discussion. So here's my question. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever had the experience where you have a favorite song, you sing it all of the time, you love it, and then one day somebody says to you, you know those aren't actually the lyrics to that song, right? You're singing it wrong. Show of hands, who's had that happen? A lot of us have had that happen. I think my favorite one is probably Elton John's Benny and the Jets. I still don't actually know what the actual lyrics are to that song, and that has never stopped me from singing at the top of my lungs. I feel like that kind of experience of slight embarrassment and kind of like, oh, I have to rethink this song and what it means to me, and possibly even what the song itself means. I've had a couple times where I was singing a song and somebody was like, oh, that's what the lyric actually is. And I'm like, that completely changes the context of all of this, and I don't know if I can sing this anymore. That experience, kind of on a small scale, is essentially the experience that I went through as an artist and as a Christian in kind of confronting some of my own history, the culture that I was a part of, realizing that there were subtexts and themes and ideas that were instituted and integrated into things I had been taught and raised in that didn't mean what I thought they meant. And it left me wondering about, where does my faith go? What do I do next? And about that same time, my niece was born, and that brought up a whole new set of questions for me as a new auntie. I had this experience where actually, because it was 2020 and COVID, my sister was actually on FaceTime for quite a bit of the end of her labor, because my mom is a doula and a student midwife and was trying to coach her through some of the last moments while she was at the hospital and couldn't be present with her. And so I got to kind of be there in the room, even virtually, as my sister was accomplishing this amazing thing, bringing my niece into the world. And about an hour later, we finally got to see this beautiful new human being who has got me completely wrapped around her finger. And it kind of led me to realize I had grown up my whole life with this kind of implicit and sometimes explicit belief that to be a good Christian woman meant you were going to get married, you would have kids, you would have a godly marriage, you'd raise godly children, and that's the most important thing you could do for God. And then looking at the face of my niece, I realized, I don't think I'm ever going to have kids. That's not my calling. My calling is an artist. I may never get married for the exact same reason. So why did God make me a woman if that was all I was supposed to do, and now I can't accomplish this role that I was supposed to have? And then looking at my niece going, I don't want to limit her options someday either. And what are we going to do about that? Fortunately for me, as I was having all of these questions and kind of wrestling through my own identity and my faith and having this kind of crisis of faith, I enrolled at WashU, which you would not think of a secular institution as being the best place to work out your faith with fear and trembling, but it ended up being one of the best possible communities to ask questions and to have people who could hold space and kind of help me work through all of these things. And so the work you see before you tonight is work that was generated both during my 2 years as a Master's of Fine Arts and Visual Arts student. It's also some work that's been accomplished since I graduated in May. It was work that I couldn't do alone. As I started to kind of wrestle through themes and ideas and kind of understanding my own history, I started to realize it was becoming the sound of one hand clapping. It was just becoming the things I was personally annoyed with or found a little bit problematic. But there were so many other things I couldn't speak to, and I started to grow a little bit concerned that maybe I was complaining about things that nobody else complained about. And so I started thinking about what it would look like to invite other people into that process. And in the process of doing that, I ended up sending out a Facebook invite to anybody that was friends with me on Facebook that said, if you are a woman or identify as a woman and you have been to church and would like to work on an art project with me as yet undefined, contact me and I will send you a giant email full of instructions. And that became kind of the genesis of the Women's Chapel. Out of that initial group that I sent that out to, I had 25 women that had reached out and said, I would be willing to share a story and to see what this could become. You'll see photos of some of them in some of the work. What you maybe won't see right away, but is 100% present, is the conversation and the life that we shared together as we were doing the work over the last almost 3 years now. Even the self-portraiture work that I did is infused with the conversations that we had together as a group. One of the things as I was doing the work that became really important was to let people tell their own story and to not micromanage what that story might be, to not make myself hopefully some hero or savior that has to tell somebody's story for them. Some of that work isn't always represented in this show because it was often very deeply personal. But a lot of those conversations are still present. You'll see there's a piece that's on the wall right over here, this long newsprint piece. There's some text there that come from comments that were made during conversations with the women in my group. The same thing with the book that's on the pedestal. It's full of quotes from ladies in the group. They've formed both kind of the beginning and the end of the show. They're the heart of the show for me. There were moments as I was creating the work for this show where, actually I think Heather was on my, one of the initial critiques that I had. One of the features of the WashU program is you have to do a big review at the end of every semester. And the very first semester I stood up there in front of all these professors and they asked me questions about the work that I had done. And I burst into tears in the middle of that, my first big professional review of work, because I made a comment about how it was hard to deconstruct a house you were still living in. And that became a consistent theme in doing the work, that it was personal. It was about my own lived experience, and it was about something I deeply, deeply care about. I very much love the church. It is a place where I found so much healing and growth and community since the time I was literally born until now. I'm still a very active churchgoer, except for the days when I do a little Church of the Holy Comforter, because it didn't get out the house fast enough. And I love being able to go to church with my family and raising my niece and my nephew. Well, I'm not raising them, my sister is, but being able to be there. And I want the church to become a place that is the thing that I remember as a child, without maybe some of the hard baggage that comes with, and some of the hard questions. So that is kind of the heart of the show. The show kind of runs through a gambit. If you have gotten a chance to take in some of the work, or if you get a chance after we've kind of had the discussion, it kind of goes in a, I think, counterclockwise way. It's clockwise for me. It kind of starts with some of the problem, thinking through the limitations that are sometimes placed on women. Often it's a limitation in how we read or think about things, specifically in this case scripture for Christians. That is usually the thing that's kind of guiding and directing us, and sometimes how we start becomes where we end. So maybe opening that up a little bit, thinking about how oftentimes rules or things that are meant to keep people safe sometimes take precedent over, and can then become something that can accidentally harm somebody. Which then kind of gets into some of the very deeply dark and disturbing things that have happened in churches, that are represented by some of the women in my group who have shared very deep stories of awful, awful things that have happened in church spaces. And then it kind of comes back around into some of the kind of like humor of things, looking at things that at the time you were in it, it seemed totally normal, but then you step outside it for a little bit, and then it's suddenly like, this is kind of odd. Why did we think this way? But then it gets into the work that I did with my group, looking at the conversations that we had, and that the heart of the group really is for the church. Of the 25 women that I worked with, I believe there's only one woman who is no longer a Christian, and almost all of them are still very active at their churches as well. And so this is a conversation that was very much deeply a part of who we all were and who we want the church to be, and to be able to continue to practice a faith that we all very deeply believe in, even if it's in, slightly different contexts. And then one of the things we're going to get to do tonight, in the kind of inside of this little space, is kind of an inner chapel space. It's meant to be a space for contemplation and reflection. When there's this many people, it's hard to be contemplative and reflective all in one tiny space. And so the prompts that we're going to do tonight are kind of to help have that experience as well. Because one of the things that becomes difficult when you're having conversations about gender, about power imbalance, about abuse, a lot of things can come up, especially when it's art. Art can sometimes slip in under the radar and catch you at a place you were not quite expecting. And so the goal, hopefully, with these prompts is to help you kind of process some of the emotions, some of the thoughts and ideas that are coming up, and then start to think about ways going forward as well. So that's kind of the general overview. Yeah.
So if you look towards the back of the books in front of you, you will see that we're now going the first prompt. And feel free to walk around and look at the art. Feel free throughout this program if you want more soup or bread. This amazing food that we have here. There's desserts back there as well, and drinks. The first prompt is, how can rage born of care transition to action born of love? So we'll take 5 minutes for you to think, write whatever notes you might want to write, listen to the beautiful music, and then we'll return. Wow, thank you both so much. That was beautiful. All right, so now I will turn it over to Professor Heather Bennett for her comments, 10 minutes or so.
Okay. Hi. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much for listing all of that. I started to get a little bit red. But my work is very much aligned with some of the, I think some of the foundational cores of what Megan's trying to do. We met originally in the MFA program, as one of her advisors, and then also she took a class of mine that I teach called Contemporary Discourses, Art plus Feminism, which talks about the overlap between the huge topics of art and feminism and all those possibilities of those overlaps and the spaces in between. Who's included in both of those disciplines and who is left out of those disciplines, and we talk about that and we interrogate that, and we find new ways of looking at both of those topics and how they fit together. In that last prompt, where I think is really instructive to kind of the way that what this whole show sort of makes me think of, in that, like, a lot of the work that we talked about in that class, it begins as a kind of refusal, of the status quo, or awakening to something that you have to speak against. But then what it becomes is a recreation, and I think that's another step. And that's something that Megan has done, starting to refuse, starting to push away through rage and grief, but then recreating that, making something new. And that's something that I've tried to do in my own work as well, where I'm working with women's images in contemporary media, and that's it's such an important effect, I think, on how women are treated and how they are seen, and how we assume from how they're seen who they are, and those assumptions lead to assumptions. I'm teaching that class again this semester, and we were just talking about the artist Valley Export, who's really important in the beginning of the kind of even the term feminist art, which is not what that class specifically necessarily addresses, sometimes outside of that terminology, but really started in the 70s, when there were or late 60s, mid to late 60s, early 70s, when there was beginning to be language for that. And Valley Export was really important in that movement, and probably loosely a part of this kind of group of works that we loosely put together under the term body art, was talking about how women were using their own bodies at that time in order to refuse certain definitions of what those bodies are, becoming subjects and away from objects. So their assumed objectshood being transformed by their own agency to subjects. But also that idea that, because she talks about women's oppression being outlined through the history of women's oppression being outlined through the history of images, because that image of the body, how it is seen, is so important in limitations. And so that taking that back, having that agency, is really that first step of refusal. But then there is that step of recreation. What do you put in its place, where you push away from the house that you live in, that you know? How do you come back? How do you create something new? How do you create a group that becomes something like the Women's Chapel? I think it was really interesting and inspiring to see you really have that idea coming in, but not knowing what it was going to be, not knowing that it wasn't necessarily an actual space or chapel. We're in a space, but what that became is something so much more, so much bigger, that involved participation and collaboration and coming together to not just solve problems, but to create new ones. And I think that recreation is so important in that, but that's not to discount the rage and the grief. They have really important roles, of course, as I think so many of you probably know from your own experience. But the idea that Also, I think, too, sometimes we see this work, contemporary art, especially when talking about some of these earlier works that were so framed by rage because it was like a break, a rupture, and the taking back had to be so dramatic. In some ways, that paved the way for us to make more subtle and more nuanced statements. But that still sometimes I think we and some of my students tend to create a binary of work that is a refusal or a critique or rageful, as opposed to work that is using joy and celebration. And I think that binary is really really limiting and doesn't show all of the nuances that overlap with those categories, but everything also in between and spilling out all over. Sometimes it's really hard to hear the stories of the bodies subjected, the identities and the bodies subjected to certain kinds of oppression, but to see it as only one way is to really also cut off those nuances and the variation and the beauty of those identities subjected to that oppression. So I think that idea of listening, that idea of cooperation is part of our arsenal, I guess, against that. And that the idea of being rageful and having grief and being uncomfortable is also very generative, and it can go towards change, not just changing your own mind, but changing others and then changing mores. I'm sure many of us have heard the quote from John Stuart Mill where he talks about the idea that what is status quo is where society leads us to believe that is what is natural, but it's not necessarily what is natural. It is just what is institutionalized. What is our institutional foundation? What is our education that we have learned since we started to walk, since before we started to walk? A quote that I really like and that I tell my students in the beginning and then we come back to at the end is from Brazilian novelist Clarice Lispector. And the quote is, "For my house to function, I demand as my primary duty that I be a phony, that I not exercise my revolt and my love, both set aside. If I'm not a phony, my house trembles. I must have forgotten that beneath the house is the land, the ground upon which a new house might be erected. Meanwhile, we sleep and falsely save ourselves." So I think that this project is really about that, about building a new foundation, even if it is a foundation and it is so hard to tremble and let go of it, that there is down under there is that earth that something else can be built upon. And I just love seeing that the Women's Chapel didn't just grow in school and to your thesis, and that's the end, that is continuing to grow and being continually rebuilt. So congratulations, Megan.
Thank you so much, Heather. Those were wonderful comments. There's a lot to think about. Thank you. Now it's time for our second prompt, which is, as you'll see in your book, what does it mean to sit with grief? What does it mean to lament together? So if you can take the next 5 minutes to reflect and respond to these questions, and we'll return at 7 o'clock. Thank you again so much. Now, these are my comments, and I have props, which I warned Megan about before. You want to help me? So when I think about what Megan is doing, I'll just pass the brown one per table. It's not quite enough for every table, but maybe people can share. When I think about Megan and look at the art, like Heather, I think about what the images are talking back to and talking back against. And images such as all of us who were raised as evangelical girls, as I was as well, absorbed as children. And I'm of an older generation than Megan and most of you here, but I think the general image has stayed pretty close to the same. And so the props that I brought, I wanted us to take a look at the Bible zine called Revolve. Anybody remember Revolve from their childhood? A few hands back there. So I think this is something that gives us some clues about the meanings of femaleness and femininity and submission in popular evangelical culture in our own time. So Revolve was a Bible zine. It contains, each edition that you see contains the entire New Testament in a very specific translation in a kind of glossy format, interspersed with the kinds of things that were found in other girls' and women's magazines, like quizzes and fashion and beauty tips and other kinds of advice columns and, things of that sort. The first one was published in 2003. And I have them going up to about 2010 or maybe a little after. They are no longer in existence. In fact, they're hard to find online. You can find them on eBay. But Thomas Nelson, the Christian publisher who published them, has just seemingly eradicated all traces of it from their website. So there's a story there to be told, I'm sure. But Thomas Nelson marketed Revolve by saying that, teen girls weren't wanting to read the Bible. They found it too heavy and big and freaky looking, I think they said in their materials. And so this fashion magazine format for the New Testament is the perfect solution to that problem, they said in their marketing materials. Teen girls feel comfortable exploring the scriptures in the New Century version. And over 500 further study notes because of the relevant language and format. Revolve is the new look for teen Bible publishing. And these were pretty successful. There were well over a million, a couple million, I think, that were sold over these years. There were a couple of others. I think there's one out there, maybe some of you got one. There was one called Divine Health, that was about how good Christians needed to be perfectly fit and thin and healthy and beautiful. There was Magnify, which was the complete New Testament for kids that had superheroes and interactive games and quizzes and all. And then there was one that somebody's got out there called Refuel, which is the complete New Testament for guys. And so it was like sports and entertainment and all the cool stuff. And you can just, to me, there's no better window onto the kinds of expectations what evangelical girls in that era, not so long ago, and I would say still today in our own era, were being sort of steeped into. Around purity, around submission, obedience, goodness, and all, as you see the images, these sort of conventionally pretty, very cheery, shiny, happy people images, right, that you see there. And so I wanted to bring that because I think it's really relevant to you and your collaborators, and as Heather was talking about too, what you're talking against. And this question of then what is recreated from that, I think is so amazing. Some of the Revolve magazines, I think you see it if you've got the 2008 edition, have, they're interspersed with stories of very broken women. There's one of Rebecca. I think if somebody's got the one with the bookmark in it, there's a story of this girl, Rebecca, who talks about becoming a drug addict and becoming homeless and and then pregnant when she's 16. And then she's swept up by a Christian family, and they rescue her by finding her a husband, ultimately. Whereas on the very same page, opposite, there's a little story from a boy, Chad, I think is his name, where he's saying, I think we should be able to read the Bible for ourselves. We don't always have to agree with what the pastors say. Like the boys get to disagree, and the girls have to find a husband, to help them in the world. I mean, the messages they almost hit you over the head with kind of the literalness of that. So these clearly defined gender roles, I think, really are what I want to point to, and what I think so many of your images are pointing against. And as girls become young women and they begin to rethink, as you did and your collaborators have, what these gender roles are going to look like, that's a very complicated and difficult process, and you're not going to get there through some of the, the revolve type of literature. And I also want to say there's also a lot about sex. I've mentioned purity culture. There's a lot of questions in these zines from girls who, supposedly these are questions from girls. How far can they go without going too far? What does dating mean in a Christian context? I'm sure this is very familiar to all of you. So again, Megan, I think what I see you and your collaborators as doing is talking back to this popularized, glossy Christianity, a Christianity that I think, I won't put the words in your mouth, but to my mind, tries to hide its patriarchal structures behind these pictures of pretty, carefree, good girls. And so the central question for me that I hope we can talk about and discuss together at the end of viewing the array of images here is again, and I think this goes with Heather's points too, what emerges in the place of that version of Christianity. Do you think, is your art documenting ultimately a passage out of Christianity altogether? I think from your original comments you would say no, that you are still very much in the church. Is it primarily you're documenting the grief of giving up one version of something that turned out not to be what you were taught it was, as you suggested? Is it a plea for a different kind of Christianity that is truly egalitarian and liberating? And so I'm curious if you and your collaborators see yourselves as having one foot in and one foot out of the tradition, or are you finding your way toward other egalitarian churches because they do exist out there in the world? Or do they seem to represent a really soft and shallow kind of Christianity, which is what most of us were taught as evangelicals, that the liberal churches aren't even true Christianity, right? So I'd love to really understand more about what's going on in these depictions, and also where all of you find joy once your relationship to the church has been so challenged. And I suppose that in order to answer these questions, another one really has to be asked, and so I really do want to pose this to you. Is it possible to rid Christianity of patriarchy and misogyny? Or are those features so deeply baked in to Christian history, into scripture, into theology, that to eradicate them just leaves the tradition in shreds? It's basically to just burn the whole thing to the ground. I know that some would answer that Christianity is the religion of Jesus, and that Jesus didn't articulate a patriarchal theology, which we can debate. But Christianity, as it's come down to us, as we know, is not simply the religion of Jesus. It's the religion of Paul and the church fathers. It's the religion of Aquinas and Augustine and the male European popes that defined the tradition since Jesus' death. And whether we've read those figures or not, that's what has defined the tradition into our own time. I think a lot of us raised as Protestants were taught that we had nothing to do with the Catholic Church, but of course we emerged from the Catholic Church. That is the foundation for what we have. So there's a great deal in common there, and the hierarchy is pretty baked in. Over the centuries, church leaders have consistently taught that sex is evil, or at best a necessary evil for the procreation of the race, of human life. Many were taught the human body is a source of terrible sin, and that women are temptresses and meant to be the servants of men. They are less than men. And this is represented in an infinite number of ways. So I'm interested in opening up these questions of how do you ultimately separate patriarchy out from Christianity? Can you? And I wonder finally if what you and your collaborators are actually showing us in this marvelous work are snapshots of where you are in this moment in that journey with regard to your relation to the church. 10 years from now, 20, 50, these images may seem as though they exhibit a specific life stage through which you were passing, even though you weren't thinking of it that way at the time. That's how all of our lives are, right? So I'd love to hear more about the process of getting to the stage that you're in now, and your collaborators, and what you anticipate will come next. So thank you. And now it is time for our third and final prompt for the evening, and that is, what does hope look like in the process of grief? So now we'll take the next 5 minutes to reflect and respond to this question with our amazing, beautiful musicians, and we'll return at 7:15. gorgeous. I have to say, I think I overheard that you all just met each other this evening. Is that true? Isn't that amazing? They just met. You were both just fantastic. So that was really great. All right. Well, Megan, it is now your turn to speak, whether you want to respond to Heather and me or talk about broader ideas, your thoughts for next steps and where all of this leads, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion.
Yeah, so it's kind of fun. Both Heather and Marie have brought up two concepts that are concepts I absolutely love in theology. I think you mentioned it earlier. I was originally a theology student at Fuller Seminary before I switched and went to finish and do the MFA. But at my heart, I am still very much an old theologian. Maybe more like Linus and the Peanuts than like Martin Luther or something like that. But you were talking about the idea of recreation, and then you were talking about the idea of critique. And is this thing so broken it can't be fixed? And I was thinking about both of those ideas are kind of central to the Christian concepts of redemption and hope. When we talk about hope, Americans have kind of a flabby idea of hope because we use the word hope kind of flippantly. Like, I hope I get to go outside today and it's not snowing and icing and I can actually get to work without sliding there. Or I really hope the Cardinals win this year. You know, those kinds of things. That's generally how we use the word hope. When we talk about hope from a Christian theological context, that is not what we're talking about. Hope is something that we already know the answer to, and it's a thing that carries us through in the moments that are the absolutely darkest, most horrific. It's the thing you cling to and you know is at the base. It's that earth, that's that solid foundation that even if everything else is razed to the ground, I know this is still here. For me, that moment happened in the fall, like right at the beginning. I think it was August of 2021. I read this book called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumais, who's a historian and scholar that works out of Calvin College in, I think, Grand Rapids. Mm-hmm. And you might notice I did an homage to her work with this piece that's over here that it feels wrong to say this, but is like one of my favorite pieces in the show. And in her book, she talks a lot about these kind of themes of gender, of power imbalance, of hierarchy, of how evangelical culture often is not about theology, it's about shared cultural beliefs and ideas. And in the process of that book, she tore down what felt like my entire life, like everything that I had ever trusted in, every voice I'd grown up hearing and being told this is a good person to listen to. She revealed things that I didn't know about that I found deeply, deeply upsetting. And I remember I was house sitting for a friend, sitting on their couch, listening to their dog go ballistic at fireworks, going, I think my whole life has been a lie, and what do I do next? And then I started school. And ironically enough, this is like, it's a bit embarrassing to say, one of the ladies in the collaborative group who is very hard to impress with literally anything, told me about this television show that's out there called The Chosen, which some of you may have heard of. And it's a depiction of Jesus and his ministry that is more focused on telling a really good story than on sometimes the other things that can kind of go into evangelical media. So it's actually really well acted by professional actors. It's got really high production quality. It's one of those where you didn't kind of cringe while you were watching it. And through watching several episodes of that show, I found the Jesus I had known as a child that was all about critiquing systems that were broken, that left people behind, that hurt people when most everybody else maybe felt like, oh, this is fine, it's okay. There are moments in that show where the creators chose to remind people that women were a part of Jesus' disciples too. They were present in the things that he was doing. And I remember sitting in my room bawling at moments during that show because I saw myself represented. I saw the women I was working with represented. I think it is possible to create a version of our faith. Not even a version of our faith. I think it's possible that our faith is actually not tied into patriarchy and misogyny and power and the lording of power from one person over another based on a set of descriptions that change every generation. I don't think that's what Jesus meant when he wrote, or he didn't technically write, when he spoke the things he spoke and people wrote them down. I don't think it's even really what the Apostle Paul meant when he was writing his letters, which can be a controversial opinion, but I know it's not the sort of thing that the people who loved me the most deeply in church meant when they were teaching me things, even if they taught me something wrong. It definitely wasn't what my parents meant. And it's a thing, I think, that keeps the women that are in my group wrestling through their relationship with the church. Some of the ladies in my group have found churches that are what would be considered more liberal or progressive, but many of them have stayed at churches that are more conservative or have more conservative values about women in leadership, about the roles that they can have, because they want to be there to start to change the dial. One of the things when I was discussing this show with the curator here at Intersect, and she was asking me questions about, like, what would you want to see changed? Like, what are some tangible things you would want to see changed? And it's hard to put a specific to that, because there are things I personally want to see changed. I don't always know if those are the right things, though, because sometimes those are just like personal pet peeve things. Even if they're well researched and like they were part of my thesis, it's still things that would make my life more comfortable. Maybe it doesn't make something better for somebody else. And one of the things I kind of started to come back to, and I think it's a heart of the work that's done here at Intersect, is this idea of listening to another person, even when it's deeply uncomfortable. And as I think about what does hope mean, what does redemption mean, what does recreation mean, even what does critique mean, it's about listening and about having this openness to listen. The ladies in my group are so good at showing this. There's a work, and it'll be kind of the last thing I'm going to talk about, the work that's right here on this wall that features the two photos with the kind of long strand. It's part of a larger series of work that I've been kind of slowly working on as I come out of school, where I did this assignment where I had all of the women in our group. Our group is represented by both people that live in St. Louis and people that live very far out of St. Louis, which provides some challenges for trying to feel integrated as a group. And so I did an assignment where I had them each fill out a little Google form that had emotion words, and then I asked them to choose an emotion word and write a small paragraph about how that emotion compared to their past church experience and their current church experience, even if their current church experiences they don't go. And then I took those answers from the entire group, divided them up, and kind of arranged them according to the emotions, made them somewhat anonymous, and then printed them out and gave them to a group that met in person here in St. Louis. And we read them together kind of silently at first, and then I broke people up into groups to kind of discuss them as like smaller kind of pairs. And then we got back into a large group and talked about what does it mean to embody the story of another person? Because that's essentially what this entire show is asking of the viewer, is to step into somebody else's story, even when it gets really uncomfortable and when it maybe challenges beliefs, or maybe you don't have any like resemblance to any of this. Maybe your experience wasn't in the church, and so all of this is kind of strange. Sometimes strange is just as uncomfortable as something that hits a little close to home. And then I asked them, as we were taking these photos and trying to embody these stories, to come up with poses that helped show the things that we were reading and the things that our fellow sisters were talking about. This particular set of photos was from the quote that's actually at the bottom of that piece of paper. It was represented by a woman who lives out of St. Louis, and she talked about peace and chaos and how these two things exist for her in her current church experience. And that she's someone who was working in youth group ministry and was actually ordained by her church. They made her an actual minister to be able to do the work that she was doing. And it caused some rupture in the church that she was in, because some people were not convinced that that is the sort of thing a woman should be allowed to do, and some people left. And yet, in spite of the chaos of that, the church leadership that she was working with stood by her and continued to support her in the work that she was doing. They're not a super progressive church. They don't have really wild liberal ideas about the Bible and theology, and yet they were willing to take a chance on changing something that could have been really difficult and was really difficult. And so our group then worked on embodying this idea of peace and chaos and of the care that is present in that space. And that's kind of the hope I have for everybody as you leave tonight, thinking about how to embody the story of another person, how to take a second when you're hearing a story that's deeply challenging to your own beliefs and try to see it from that person's perspective and their point of view. It's really difficult. Our culture is not set up, whether you're in the church or out of the church. Sometimes it's worse out of the church in some ways. We're not really set up to listen to one another. We're set up to react to one another constantly. And so having this moment to just instead respond with listening. I think it was actually Christina who wrote about the music, talking about having kind ears, believing the best of somebody, even when they're working through something and trying to figure it out. I think each one of us has people in our lives that are going through things that we can support better through listening. You don't have to be a part of a church to have this conversation about how to support women around you. It could be people at your job. It could be the moms in your mom's group. It could be just your best friend who's going through a tough time. It could be on a big institutional level. Maybe you have political influence and power. Or you have, a very loud voice in a space like a church. But it could be just as small as, having goofy conversations with your niece. And so as you're thinking about going forward, coming out of this space, and even as we discuss the rest of this evening, that's my hope, is that you have a hope that says at the baseline of all of this, there is still some goodness. There are people who still find a lot of value in this thing. And while we're willing to tear it down brick by brick and evaluate each piece of it, we still want it to be good. And we're going to find a way to find the good in it. And that hopefully, in the process of finding that good, we get to invite other people into that as well and create healing and hope for others. So,
Great, I think that deserves an applause. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan. And I didn't mention this earlier because honestly, I didn't know about it until I looked in here. But this curatorial statement that you wrote, Sarah, or you wrote this, is that right? It's beautiful. So take these home and read her curatorial statement about this work. It's really, really wonderful. And I hadn't even realized you did it. I'm sorry, I would have acknowledged that sooner. But it's lots of good stuff in here. And I also want to let you all know, before we turn to your questions, if you'd like to hear Megan talk more about her art, Catherine Spearing, who's here tonight, has a podcast called Tears of Eden podcast. And oh, I'm sorry, Insurgent. That's a different, sorry, Insurgent. And maybe you could tell people where to find that, but you did a wonderful interview with Megan about a year, well, maybe not quite a year ago, on her art. So would you say a word about it?
Yes, it is. It's called Uncertain Podcast, and Megan was amazing talking about her art and her project. And if you're uncertain about the name of the podcast, it's called Uncertain.
Sorry about that, Catherine. Yeah, I can vouch. It's a wonderful conversation that the two of you have.
Marie's going to be on in February.
I am talking about clergy abuse and other fun things. So it is now at last time for your questions and answers. And for the sake of the recording, when you ask your question, try to be loud, and then I'm going to repeat it so that the folks who are viewing the video later can participate as well. So please, the floor is open. Anything anyone wants to ask about the art, if you want to wander around and look around as we talk, that's fine as well. I know. It is hard being the first person.
okay, so as you have laid out the problems, quote unquote, as you work with your group, what, for people who do identify as faithful believers, for people that do find themselves in church spaces that maybe are not necessarily liberal, progressive, female-oriented, what would you say if they don't know what practical steps they should be taking? How can they, who maybe don't feel like they have a voice, give a voice in their context, in their space, if that's something they feel like they want to do, but they're very clueless on how to do it?
Why don't you repeat the question?
Yeah. Okay, so the question was for people that are still Christians and are deeply involved at churches, but maybe are part of churches that are not liberal or progressive and are kind of struggling with some of the systems that say women can't have certain types of roles or agency, kind of what did they do next? What's kind of a next step for them? That is a really tough question. Could do the classic, that is a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking that. So I think one of the things that I did that actually one of the ladies in our group reflected on, we reflected on this together, women, when they get together and have conversations, tend to start talking about issues while also talking about like where to find the coolest new thing at Aldi. There's something about the conversations of women that's very generative and tends to get to the heart of certain things, but it's actually very difficult for women to find time to meet together, especially if they have children if you've got a lot of commitments you're running around. And I think that's actually, it's at the heart of this show, and I think it's at the heart of any kind of like lasting change, is having conversations as a community. Finding that community in other people, asking tough questions about yourself. That's sometimes the hardest work to do, is to say, what am I actually willing to risk? What am I really willing to push against? If this gets really, really hard and I find I can't stay here anymore, what do I do next? Being able to ask yourself some of that up front instead of kind of getting caught off guard with it. But I think finding people who are willing to ask those tough questions with you, whether or not you agree on the answers, is a huge first step. I think there's also a lot of things that we tend to get this idea, no matter what big problem we're talking about, that we have to fix the top of the mountain instead of the bottom of the mountain first. And so we want to go for the peak thing, like the thing that would fix everything. And so like in church conversations, when we're talking about women's roles and gender imbalance, the first thing people go to is, well, women should just be pastors. If like women were pastors and then they had all this power, we could fix the problem. And that might fix the problem. It might also create a whole host of other problems we didn't foresee. Whereas maybe starting with something very small that is sustainable, that is built in community, is actually the most helpful. One of the things that the church I'm currently going to does that isn't necessarily related to women's roles, but I think is one of the healthiest things I've ever seen a church do, is they have town hall meetings before every major church decision. And so about a month before a voters meeting happens, or we have to make a certain decision about something, or sometimes just to check in on something we're not really sure about, the church will have lunch afterwards, and everybody kind of gathers together, the situation's kind of explained, and then people have a chance to voice any opinion, question, comment, frustration, whatever that might be. And then we don't have to make a decision that day. It's just to be able to share together, to hear each other, and to think about concerns that maybe you didn't think about before. I think that is such a great model that would be actually really easy to institute at a lot of churches. It takes a lot of practice to listen, to not run over people with your idea and like your opinion being the most important thing. I think it takes a lot of work to foster a community that listens that well. But I think that's a sort of change that is going to be actually maybe achievable for people on the ground in lay spaces that maybe don't have a lot of like big spiritual power, as it were. And that can be as simple as you have a little moms group and you start talking about some of these things and how to support each other in moments when it's frustrating. Or it could be as big as maybe you are a leader in a church or a similar type of organization, and you say, let's have some of these kind of town hall type discussions to be able to share with one another our concerns.
If you have any questions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think that like, and I think that's so much how you kind of reacted to your own discomfort was reaching out to have conversations, and it so parallels to what a lot of women's groups in the 60s and 70s were doing, and that were generative of so much of the art we talked about in class, and they called us consciousness raising groups, but it was just, a lot of it just about finding time to listen to each other and to see that these problems that you thought were you, or you getting in the way or not doing the right thing, were really shared and larger root problems than yourself.
Yeah. Can I just say, Megan, I agree that having women pastors doesn't necessarily solve all the problems, although I am all for it, let me just say. But it does seem to me, as I've done the research I've done on clergy abuse, it is so clear that some congregations are so top down. A lot of these independent, non-denominational churches where I've interviewed people, and these pastors and kind of pastoral leadership teams even become, they lack all accountability from the people on the ground. So there is, even if it's not necessarily a gender, thing, that because women pastors can fall in love with their own power too, right? That's definitely true. But I do think there's a leadership issue in a lot of churches that is kind of, I think a very important factor in all of this too. So, and I want others to raise your hands and, have this be a conversation, but I guess one question that I had for you, you've now met women and men from a lot of different congregations in the St. Louis area, and I don't know how comfortable you would be. I mean, if there are you can see kind of emerging models or emerging congregations that are doing a better job, where women, in your group or that are finding kind of better practices, more valuing of them, more listening, more and better leadership structures. I don't know.
One of the things that I love about the church I currently go to is I was really honest with the leadership at the church about who I was, what I was going through, and one of the responses from that was, sorry, I'm going to cry if I say this. One of the responses to that was, from the pastor, the lead pastor, he said, if I ever do something that you find problematic or offensive or just even are a little bit uncomfortable with, he's like, I want you to come to me. He's like, my only caveat is please don't yell at me when you do it, but I still want you to come to me with that thing. And I remember when he said that being just absolutely floored, because the previous church I had gone to the leadership a couple of times about things I was deeply concerned about. It was in the height of COVID, so some of it had to do with race and the conversations that were happening or not happening at that time. Some of it had to do with the way that women were treated in our church, both at a denominational level and at the actual church level. And I was met with what seemed like openness, but it was always a backpedaling of well, that doesn't really happen here, but we're doing this to kind of address it, but not really address it. And so to have somebody kind of unprovoked just say, I'm willing to be critiqued on things that I might have said or done that might have hurt you or felt uncomfortable, and let's have a conversation about that. And then hilariously enough, exactly a week later, we sang a hymn in church that Sunday that had some kind of unsavory colonialist tones to it. And I came to him a couple days later and was like, so can we maybe not sing this particular verse again? And he's like, yeah. And so it became this moment of we can have a conversation about this here. We can bring up tough issues. I think we have a leadership problem as human beings, regardless of what institution you're in. People who are, and I say this as an oldest sister who loves being bossy and getting people to do exactly what I want them to do. Part of the joke of being the master of mayhem is I do like being seen as an evil overlord that can get everybody to do my exact bidding, and I have literally no actual power. I think that's actually a good thing. I think we need kind of a radical rethinking of power in general and how we think about what power does, what leadership does. There's this long-standing joke in a lot of evangelical spaces about how you want to be a servant leader, which I've always joked with friends that a servant leader is just a person who helps stack chairs after church. It's kind of a code for getting somebody to participate. But the honest truth is we really do want people that lead from the bottom up, not from the top down. I think I saw that modeled in my family when my parents said, we're not above reproach. If you see something that we've done that hurt you or your siblings, I want you to confront me about it, which is fun to do to your parent when they then go, wait a minute, and then go, oh yeah, you're right, I'm sorry, I need to ask for forgiveness for that. I've seen it now modeled in a church setting with my pastor and the leadership there. I've seen it modeled in other churches in ways of making the playing field level, where the layperson is not so far underneath the leadership that they don't have any recourse or voice unless it's through somebody on staff or that has a big fancy degree. Because I think most of the places, as I did research about abuse and the abuse that happens in churches, it's almost always in a space where the pastor or the upper leadership has created a system where they have no accountability, nobody can challenge them, and it's then very difficult to stop them when they start doing things that are actually really hurtful and awful for people. And that's the thing that then becomes really hard to heal from, because how do you trust going into another space where maybe the pastor is somebody that very deeply cares about his congregation and wants to listen to their concerns, to have had somebody in that role before in this place again. And I think a lot of that's just going to be churches having the patience to work with people. I think it's also about churches being educated about what abuse is and what trauma is, how it comes up for people. the sorts of things that it might be too difficult for a person that's experienced religious trauma to actually ever be physically present in a church again. One of the things that was cool in Marie's class, we had a survivor of a Catholic sex abuse who came and talked about how he's still deeply Catholic and he still very much practices his faith, but he only goes to Mass maybe once a month because his physical and emotional body cannot handle the stress sometimes of being in that space and possibly seeing his abuser again. But he still considers himself a very strong Catholic, and he still very much practices with his faith. And so I think it's going to take the church being willing to work outside the lines a little bit and to not think about church exactly the way we've thought about it before, and to be willing to do the work, because it's a lot of work. It's very hard. You risk even a little secondhand trauma from reading about abuse and how abuse functions, the sorts of things to watch for. But that work is so necessary to be able to create systems and places where people are deeply held and cared for, where they have a voice, where power is not let run rampant and unchecked. And I think it's doable. I've seen spaces where it's happening, where people who are humble and loving and want to be able to use the little power that they have in a really good way did it by making space for other people and letting themselves be held accountable.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to close it there. That's a wonderful place to end, but we'll be around. Megan will be around for one-on-one. Please look again at the art and get refreshments. And for those of you who are taking the bus back to campus, I think you're gathering about 5 after 8 towards the door back there, leaving by 10 past. And thank you all again for being here, and let's thank Megan one more time for her beautiful art.